taking you back to 11th of September 2002, precisely a year after the horrific Al-Qaeda attacks on the United States. And Prime Minister Tony Blair met the leader of the House of Commons, Robin Cook, to discuss the march to war in Iraq. Cook took the opportunity to deliver a dire warning about the deep unpopularity of Britain taking part in any invasion. Quote, "All I ask is that every morning you remember what happened to Anthony Eden," unquote. But Blair's response was dismissive. "I can put you down then as unenthusiastic," he said. Cook wasn't the only one who was unconvinced by the case for the invasion of Iraq. The Foreign Office had identified, quote, "a repeat of the Suez debacle which had changed Arab popular opinion towards Britain for a generation as a significant risk of taking action in Iraq." Well, one big thing Blair had in common with his unfortunate predecessor, Anthony Eden, who launched the Suez invasion against Egypt in 1956, was hubris writ large. He was convinced that he knew better, that the experts were misguided, and that public opinion could be turned in his favour. On every account, just like Eden before him, he was wrong. Blair was driven by a sort of messianic fervour to change the world, summed up in delicious irony by the journalist Andrew Rawnsley, who wrote, quote, "Missionary Tony will cleanse the planet of disease, poverty and conflict. The sun will never set on the holy British Empire. The tough and tender third way will rule from Kinshasa to Kabul." So, when we consider this motion, which is a very specific motion, which regrets the decline of Western interventionism at its high point in the early 2000s, we have to ask ourselves a simple question. Do we want to go back to the days of missionary Tony and his partner, Cowboy Bush? We should be very clear about what this motion means. I'm not here to argue that there can never be circumstances in which Western intervention can be justified. Indeed, history affords us some excellent examples of when such intervention was not just justified, it was essential. On the 2nd of August 1990, the Iraqi President Saddam Hussein's army rolled across the border into the defenceless neighbouring state of Kuwait. Crushing all Kuwaiti resistance, Iraqi forces proceeded to occupy and pillage the emirate. The invasion was a clear breach of international law, and the US administration of George H.W. Bush and British government of Prime Minister John Major proceeded to assemble an international coalition encompassing not just British and American and European forces, but also Arab forces to liberate the emirate from the brutal Iraqi occupation. But crucially, Bush and Major acted through the United Nations Security Council, which passed a raft of resolutions condemning the Iraqi invasion and requiring Iraq's withdrawal from Kuwait, imposing economic sanctions, and finally setting a deadline for Iraqi withdrawal. When Iraq failed to comply, United Nations Security Council Resolution 678 authorised the use of, quote, "all necessary means" to eject Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The subsequent military operation had an impeccable legal justification, therefore, and it had a very specific goal, the liberation of Kuwait, which was swiftly accomplished. In contrast to this measured and legally well-grounded intervention to liberate Kuwait in 1991, in the wake of 9/11, Western interventionism lost its bearings. First came the intervention in Afghanistan in late 2001, which morphed from a mission to capture Osama bin Laden, the architect of the 9/11 attacks, into the goal of regime change to overthrow the Taliban government. And this led in turn to an ill-planned and ill-fated attempt at Western-led state building in Afghanistan. The collapse of the Western-backed regime and the return of the Taliban to power 20 years later saw the whole project come full circle at the cost of considerable suffering to the civilian population. large loss of life. Then came the invasion of Iraq in 2003, launched on the spurious promise of disarming the Iraqi regime of its weapons of mass destruction. The invasion followed a similar pattern, with Western-led state building after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, descending, in this case, into a catastrophic sectarian civil war. The flimsy Iraqi successor state became prey to the monstrosity of the Islamic State caliphate between 2014 and 2017, and untold suffering for the Iraqi civilian population.
So
and finally, yes?
Don't call it caliphate, it's not caliphate at all. It's just a terror group.
Okay, thank you for that point of information. And finally, under the heading of disastrous Western interventions, we should also consider the less well-known case of Libya. If you were to write a story with the most improbable twists and turns, then it would surely be the tale of British and American engagement with the regime of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. First in the 90s, Britain and the United States followed a similar path to that which had been adopted over the invasion of Kuwait. The Security Council, at their prompting, voted to place Libya under economic sanctions after Gaddafi refused to surrender the suspects of the 1988 Lockerbie bombing. Well, the economic pressure worked eventually, and the Libyan suspects were surrendered for trial in the Netherlands under Scottish law in 2000, with one defendant being convicted of the crime. But after 9/11 came a new twist in the Libyan story. Gaddafi's repression of his domestic Islamist opponents dovetailed with the Anglo-American campaign against jihadism, which Bush and Blair now champion. Following the adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, Gaddafi was now welcomed back in from the cold, with the Libyan dictator subsequently speaking by phone to Blair, whom he greeted somewhat improbably as, quote, a leader of oppressed peoples, unquote, a presumed reference to Blair's role as leader of the British Labour Party. Well, the man formerly dubbed Mad Dog Gaddafi by Britain and the United States was now welcomed into Tony Blair's big tent, with the British government even going so far as to cooperate in the extraordinary rendition to Libya of Gaddafi's opponent, Abdul Hakim Belhaj, in 2004. An illegal act for which the government subsequently had to issue an apology. Well, the final twist in the tale came in 2011 against the backdrop of the Arab Spring and the revolt against Gaddafi. The Western powers reversed policy once again and launched an ill-planned intervention in Libya. Although Gaddafi's regime was toppled, what followed was once again devastating civil strife, division, and Libya's descent into the status of failed state. So the conclusion is surely very clear. While we should be ready to intervene in situations such as the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, where a clear breach of international law has taken place and a broadly based international coalition can be assembled to right the wrong, we should not regret the decline of Western interventionism from its heyday in the 2000s. Western leaders at that time overreached, and to borrow from the title of my most recent book, they acted as false prophets with their interventions driven by hubris, resulting in disaster.